The star was dying, and so was Dr. Elena Marquez's career. She stared through the reinforced observation window at the crimson giant pulsing its last, its once brilliant core spewing waves of exotic particles into the vacuum of space. The light flickered like a heartbeat, weak but defiant. Elena's lips curled into a bitter smile. It was fitting, really. They were both running out of time. She adjusted the controls on her holographic interface, her fingers trembling with a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The station's AI, a monotone entity named Argos, interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Marquez, the extraction module is nearing capacity. Shall I initiate containment protocols? Not yet, Elena murmured. Her eyes glinted with determination. We're close, Argos. Just a little longer. Close to what? Redemption. Proof that her theories weren't the ravings of a desperate scientist clawing for relevance. The papers, the accusations, the disgrace. None of it would matter once she proved that time itself could be bent, twisted, and remade. The dying star was her key. Its exotic emissions were a phenomenon no one else had dared to study this closely, not after the Eclipse protocols had branded such research as too dangerous, too unpredictable. But Elena didn't care about restrictions. She had nothing left to lose. Her gaze flicked to the small, cracked photograph pinned to the console, a younger version of herself, smiling beside a man whose face she could barely look at anymore. Lucas! The memory stabbed her like a blade, but she let the pain linger. It was fuel. Containment breach imminent in Extraction Bay 3, Argos announced. Recommend immediate action. Elena snapped back to the present. Override safety protocols. Stabilize the field manually. Dr. Marquez, the AI said, its tone taking on a rare note of hesitation. Continuing this experiment exceeds the station's operational parameters. Do you wish to proceed? Yes, she hissed. Proceed. The lab was bathed in an eerie crimson glow as the star's energy surged, flooding the containment chamber. The hum of the machinery rose to a shrill pitch, and Elena felt the vibration through the soles of her boots. She leaned over the console, sweat trickling down her temple, and adjusted the field's harmonics with a deftness born of obsession. For a brief, fleeting moment, the reading stabilized. The energy folded inward, a brilliant orb of condensed light hovering in the containment chamber, impossibly beautiful and terrifying. Then it fractured. A deafening crack reverberated through the station as the orb erupted, unleashing a pulse of light that seemed to stretch and twist the very fabric of the room. Elena was thrown to the floor, her vision swimming. Alarm screamed, and the artificial gravity flickered, pitching her sideways. Argos, she shouted, coughing as the air filled with the acrid smell of burning circuits. Status report. The AI's voice was garbled, its usual calm now fractured. Temporal anomaly detected. Crew, stasis initiated as containment collapses. What? Elena's blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The crew, what do you mean, stasis? Unintentional effect of the anomaly. All personnel, save for you, are temporarily frozen. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled into the corridor, past the observation window, and saw them frozen like statues. A technician reaching for a console, her hand suspended midair. A maintenance worker mid-stride, his face locked in a grimace. Time had stopped for everyone but her. No, she whispered. This wasn't supposed to happen. She turned back to the lab, her heart hammering. The containment chamber was in ruins, its walls warped as though melted by some unseen force. And yet, in the center of the wreckage, something shifted. A shadow. A figure. Elena froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the distortion. Its silhouette was human, but something about it was wrong. Too fluid, too disconnected from the world around it. When it spoke, the voice was eerily familiar. You've made a terrible mistake, Elena. The figure stepped into the light. It was her. Elena's breath hitched as she stared at the impossible figure standing before her. The figure was unmistakably her, though aged and hardened, with lines etched deep around the eyes and a sharpness in the gaze that felt alien to her own. The hair was streaked with gray, the posture more rigid, But it was her. Somehow. What? Elena's voice cracked, her mind struggling to grasp the reality unraveling before her. What are you? The older version of herself tilted her head, the movement precise, almost mechanical. Not what, Elena? Who? I am you. A version of you from a future that should never exist. And if you keep going down this path, you'll create it. Elena backed away, her instinct screaming at her to flee, though there was nowhere to go. The containment chamber behind her sparked and groaned as the temporal anomaly continued to pulse, the room trembling under its influence. She gripped the edge of a console to steady herself. This can't be real, she whispered. Temporal echoes, hallucinations. This is just an aftereffect of the anomaly. It's real, the older Elena said sharply, her voice carrying a weight of authority that silenced the younger woman's doubts. And you've already seen the evidence. Your crew, frozen in time, the fractures spreading through this station. Do you think that's the worst of it? Elena shook her head, her voice rising in defiance. This was controlled. I had it stabilized. It was working until it wasn't, her older self interrupted, stepping closer. You think you can control time? That you can bend the universe to your will without consequences? Look at what you've done already. And this, she gestured to the anomaly, her expression darkening, is only the beginning. Elena's hands balled into fists, anger bubbling to the surface. You're here to lecture me, to scare me into giving up. If you're me, then you know why I'm doing this. You know what's at stake. I do, the older Elena said softly, her gaze softening for the briefest moment. I know the pain that's driving you. But this isn't the answer. It wasn't for me. And it won't be for you. Then why are you here? Elena snapped, her frustration boiling over. If I'm doomed to fail, why bother showing up at all? To stop you from making the same mistakes, her future self said firmly. You think this experiment is about redemption, about proving your worth to the scientific community. But it's bigger than that. Every choice you make here ripples outward. You've already set the timeline on a collision course with disaster. The younger Elena's defiance wavered, doubt creeping into her mind. Disaster? What kind of disaster? The kind that unravels civilizations, her older self replied, her tone grim. Your breakthrough, the manipulation of time, will cascade. This star's collapse will amplify the anomaly, tearing through the fabric of space-time. Neighboring systems will be consumed. Billions will die. Elena stared, her heart pounding. You're lying. This is hyperbole. It's not that unstable. Her future self's gaze was unflinching. You've seen the initial effects. The station, the crew, the anomaly itself. It's already spreading. If you don't shut it down now, you'll cross the event horizon. Once that happens, no amount of brilliance can undo it. The lab shook violently, a deep groan reverberating through the structure as another burst of energy rippled from the containment chamber. Elena instinctively reached for the console, trying to stabilize the field. Her future self moved closer, her voice cutting through the chaos. There's still time, but only if you act now. Shut it down. Elena hesitated, her fingers hovering over the controls. The implications of failure loomed large, but so did the cost of abandoning the experiment. Years of work, everything she'd sacrificed. And what if her older self was wrong? What if this was her one chance to change everything? What happens if I don't? Elena asked, her voice trembling. Her future self's expression darkened. If you don't, you'll find out. You'll see it happen, moment by moment, as the galaxy tears itself apart. And then you'll be me, standing in the ruins of what used to be, wishing you'd done the right thing. Elena stared at her future self, the weight of the decision crushing her chest. Around them, the station groaned again, the anomaly pulsing brighter, larger. The older Elena took a step back, her voice quieter now. The choice is yours, but remember this. Time is not a tool. It's a predator, and you've already drawn its attention. The room shuddered violently, and then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, the older Elena vanished into the distortion, leaving the younger version alone with the machine and the consequences of her decision. The console beeped urgently, demanding action. Elena took a deep breath, her mind racing. There was no more time to think, only time to act. Elena's hands hovered over the console, trembling as the station's alarms shrieked around her. The pulsating light of the anomaly bathed the lab in a surreal glow, distorting everything it touched. The walls seemed to ripple like liquid, the air thick with the electric charge of something fundamentally wrong. Her future self's words echoed in her mind. Time is not a tool. It's a predator. Dr. Marquez, the AI, Argos, said, its voice crackling through the distortion. Containment systems are failing across the station. Temporal anomalies are spreading beyond the primary chamber. Elena clenched her jaw. What's the extent of the damage? Multiple breaches detected in sublevels 1 through 4. Temporal inconsistencies are propagating at an exponential rate. What about the crew? She already knew the answer, but the question spilled from her lips anyway. Status remains unchanged. Temporal stasis is still in effect. Probability of successful reanimation decreases with each passing minute. Elena felt a pang of guilt as she glanced toward the observation deck, where frozen silhouettes of the crew stood locked in the midst of their routines. She was the only one left, the only one who could stop this, or doom them all. Her eyes darted back to the anomaly. The swirling distortion had grown, a spiraling vortex of light and shadow that seemed to breathe, alive and hungry. Data streamed across her console, and she struggled to process the readings. The energy signature was escalating, but so were the fractures in the fabric of space-time. The numbers didn't lie. The station was on the verge of collapse. Argos, run a projection, she ordered. If the anomaly continues to expand, how long until it reaches critical mass? There was a pause. Then the AI replied. Approximately 13 minutes before the anomaly destabilizes the station's structural integrity. Total collapse will result in a singularity event, consuming all matter within a $20 radius. Elena's stomach dropped. 13 minutes. That's all the time I have left. Her hands flew over the controls as she fought to stabilize the containment field. The harmonics were completely out of sync, the energy spiraling beyond her control. She bit her lip, sweat trickling down her temple as she adjusted the resonance. Each adjustment felt like a desperate grasp at an unraveling thread. As she worked, fragments of the future began to bleed into the present. Ghostly images flickered at the edges of her vision. An empty station, gutted and hollow. Entire star systems swallowed by darkness. And herself, standing alone in the ruins, her face etched with despair. The voices came next. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. They spoke in overlapping tones, fragments of conversations she hadn't yet had, and regrets she hadn't yet made. Why didn't you stop it, Elena? You could have saved us. Time isn't meant to be twisted. It's all your fault. She clutched the edge of the console, her head pounding. Argos, what's happening? Temporal distortions are affecting your neural perception, the AI replied. You are experiencing echoes of potential timelines. Potential timelines? Her voice cracked. You mean this hasn't happened yet? Correct. However, the probability of these events occurring increases with every second the anomaly remains active. Her hands shook as she struggled to focus. This wasn't just a malfunction. This was a spiral, a feedback loop of cause and effect collapsing into itself. Every second she delayed, every moment of hesitation, brought her closer to the edge of disaster. She had to shut it down, but doing so meant risking everything. Her research, her reputation, and possibly her life. The thought of failure, of letting Lucas's memory go unfulfilled, twisted like a knife in her chest. This was supposed to fix everything. A sudden tremor rocked the station, and a deep groan reverberated through the walls. Sparks erupted from a nearby panel, and the lab's emergency lighting flickered. Elena, Argos said, its tone unusually urgent. The anomaly is destabilizing faster than anticipated. You must act now. She hesitated, her fingers poised over the emergency shutdown sequence. Shutting it down might save the station, but it would destroy everything she had worked for. All the data, all the progress, gone. And yet, keeping it active would doom not just her, but everything and everyone around her. Elena! Argos's voice cut through her thoughts. Critical failure is imminent. Decision required. Her mind raced. Could she salvage it? Could she find a way to fix the anomaly without shutting it down? Her future self had warned her of the risks, but she had to believe there was another way. She wasn't ready to give up. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Her fingers danced over the console, inputting a sequence she had designed as a last resort, a risky gambit to restabilize the anomaly and buy herself more time. The station trembled as the system recalibrated and the lights dimmed. Argos, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Hold on. We're not done yet. As the console beeped, she glanced toward the anomaly. The vortex flickered, shrinking for a moment before surging outward again, more volatile than ever. The air felt charged, heavy with possibility. And then she heard it again, a voice, soft but unmistakable. Time is watching, Elena. Her breath caught as she turned toward the sound. The room was empty, but the words lingered, a warning she couldn't ignore. The countdown to collapse continued. The station groaned under the weight of its own undoing. Metallic creaks echoed through the corridors as the anomaly expanded, its spiraling light reflecting off the fractured walls like shards of broken glass. Elena's fingers blurred over the console, her mind teetering on the brink of panic as she fought to contain the uncontrollable. Recalibration complete, Argos reported. Containment field integrity holding at 27%. Probability of failure remains above 90%. That's not good enough, Elena snapped, her voice tight with frustration. Reroute auxiliary power from non-critical systems. Divert everything we've got. Warning. Such actions will render life support functions unstable. Do it, she barked. If I can't stop this, life support won't matter anyway. The hum of the station's systems shifted as energy diverted to the containment field. The swirling anomaly flickered, its light dimming slightly, but the threat remained palpable. It was as if the vortex itself was alive, testing the limits of its cage, waiting for the perfect moment to break free. Elena's hands trembled as she tapped into the station's deep system diagnostics. Every warning indicator flashed red, a symphony of impending disaster. Her eyes scanned the data, desperate for a solution. There had to be something she'd missed, a way to stabilize the anomaly before it consumed them all. But no matter how she analyzed it, the numbers painted the same grim picture. The experiment was beyond saving. Dr. Marquez, Argos interjected. Incoming transmission detected. Origin unknown. Signal is heavily degraded. Elena frowned. Unknown? From where? Source appears to originate within the anomaly. Her breath caught. Put it through. Static filled the air, broken by distorted fragments of a voice. At first, it was incomprehensible, a garbled mess of syllables and tones. But then, with a crackle, the words sharpened into clarity. Elena, this is your last warning. The voice was hers again, older and colder, but this time laced with an urgency that made her skin crawl. Shut it down. Destroy it now, or everything ends. Elena gritted her teeth, anger flaring in her chest. You keep telling me that, but you never explain why. How can I fix this if you won't give me answers? Because fixing it isn't an option, the voice snapped. You don't fix time, Elena. You contain it, or you suffer the consequences. Elena slammed her fist on the console, the sound echoing in the lab. I didn't come this far to give up. If there's even the slightest chance I can stabilize it. There isn't, the voice interrupted, its tone sharp and unyielding. You're out of time, and if you hesitate now, you won't just destroy this station, you'll destroy everything. The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving only the whir of the anomaly and the pounding of Elena's heart. Her mind raced, torn between her stubborn refusal to abandon her life's work and the mounting evidence that she had no choice. Argos, she said quietly, her voice trembling. Bring up the station's emergency protocols. Accessing, the AI replied. Emergency Protocol 9 Alpha enables a full system purge, including the annihilation of active experiments. Warning. Initiating this protocol will result in the irreversible loss of all research data. Elena closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Years of work sacrificed in a single moment. Every calculation, every sleepless night, every dream of redemption erased. But if she didn't act, the cost would be infinitely greater. Dr. Marquez, Argos prompted, confirmation required. Do you wish to proceed? Her hands hovered over the console. What are the odds of survival if we purge the system? Survival probability increases to 62%. However, crew reanimation remains uncertain. Elena's throat tightened. The crew, frozen in time, their fates tied to hers. She couldn't let them die. Not like this. Her fingers curled into fists. Is there any way to isolate the containment chamber? To purge the anomaly without destroying the station? A long pause. Then Argos responded. Hypothetical solution identified. Reroute purge mechanisms to focus solely on the containment chamber. This will increase the strain on structural integrity, but may preserve key systems. And the odds? Unknown. Calculations suggest a high risk of failure. Elena exhaled sharply. Better than nothing. Do it. As Argos executed her commands, the station trembled violently, sparks raining down from the ceiling. The lights flickered, and a low rumble reverberated through the walls. On the console, the anomaly's readings spiked erratically, its energy-resisting containment with a ferocity that seemed almost sentient. Elena, Argos warned. Containment breach imminent. Purge systems online. Activation required. Her heart pounded as she stared at the final command on the screen. Initiate purge sequence. This was it. The point of no return. With trembling hands, she pressed the command. The room erupted in chaos as the purge began. The anomaly flared, a blinding surge of light that seared into her vision. The station shook violently, panels exploding and conduits bursting as the energy was forcibly expelled. Elena shielded her face, the heat scorching her skin. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of venting gas and the crackle of damaged systems. The anomaly was gone, the containment chamber a smoking ruin. Elena collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The station was still standing, but barely. She looked around, her vision blurred, her body trembling with exhaustion. Argos, she rasped, her voice barely audible. Status: anomaly neutralized. Containment chamber destroyed. Structural integrity compromised but stable. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As the echoes of the disaster faded, she realized she wasn't alone. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, stepping into the flickering light. It was her future self again, bloodied and battered, but alive. And she was smiling. You think it's over, the older Elena said. But it's just beginning. Elena staggered to her feet, her knees weak and her lungs burning as she tried to steady herself. The lab was in ruins, panels hanging loose from the ceiling and sparks erupting from scorched circuits. The faint hiss of escaping air reminded her that the station's integrity was holding on by a thread. But it was the figure before her that demanded all her attention. Her future self stood amidst the wreckage, her silhouette framed by the flickering emergency lights. Blood streaked her face, and her tattered jumpsuit was stained with grime, but the sharp intensity in her eyes was undiminished. You should be thanking me, Elena spat, her voice hoarse. I just saved the station. The anomaly is gone. Her future self tilted her head, an expression somewhere between pity and disdain crossing her face. You think that was the end? That neutralizing the anomaly fixed everything? It's contained, Elena snapped, gesturing toward the scorched containment chamber. That was the goal. No, the older Elena said, her voice low and deliberate. That was your goal. The anomaly was never the problem. It was the beginning of the problem. You've cut one thread, but the fabric of time is already unraveling. Elena's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? The station trembled as if in answer, a deep groan reverberating through the walls. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was something deeper, more primal, a wrongness that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. Argos, Elena called out, panic creeping into her voice. What's happening? The AI's response was fragmented, its normally calm voice distorted. Residual temporal instabilities detected. Collapse probability increasing. Catastrophic chain reaction imminent. Elena's heart pounded. How is that possible? I neutralized the anomaly. Her future self stepped forward, her expression grim. Neutralizing it didn't erase its effects. Every second it existed, it tore at the timeline, fraying it. You stopped the immediate threat, but the damage is still there, and it's spreading. Elena felt a sinking dread. Spreading? To where? To when? Her future self corrected. The ripple effect is already destabilizing temporal nodes throughout this system and beyond. If it reaches critical mass, it won't just destroy this station. It will erase this entire region of space from the timeline. Elena's hands gripped the console, her knuckles white. Then tell me how to stop it. If you're here, you must know. Her future self hesitated, a flicker of something almost human crossing her face. There's only one way. You have to sacrifice the station. Detonate the reactor. The resulting energy burst will collapse the timeline around this region, sealing the fractures. No, Elena said immediately, shaking her head. There has to be another way. We just need time. There is no more time. Her future self shouted, her voice cracking with urgency. You think I don't want to save them? To save myself? I've spent years, decades, trying to undo this. And every time, it leads here. To this moment. You have to make the call. The station shuddered again, and the lights flickered, plunging them into brief darkness. When the emergency lighting returned, Elena saw something new on her future self's face: resignation. Elena's mind raced. Destroying the station would kill everyone on board. The crew still trapped in stasis, frozen in time because of her experiment. And yet, the alternative was unthinkable. If the destabilization spread, it wouldn't stop with the station. It would cascade outward, consuming everything in its path. Her voice was barely a whisper. How can I be sure this will work? You can't, her future self said softly. But you don't have a choice. Elena stared at the console, her hands trembling. The reactor controls glowed on the screen, a grim reminder of the irreversible decision before her. She glanced at the observation deck, at the frozen figures of her crew, their lives suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. Argos, she said quietly, her throat tight. Prepare reactor overload protocols. Warning. The AI responded, its tone eerily calm. Executing this command will result in total station destruction. Are you certain? Her future self watched her, with piercing eyes, silent but unwavering. Elena took a deep breath, her heart heavy. No, she whispered, but it's the only way. Her fingers moved over the console, inputting the sequence. As she reached the final command, the station groaned, the sounds of its impending collapse growing louder. Elena, her future self said, her voice softer now. Whatever happens, you're not doing this alone. Elena glanced at her, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I hope you're right. She pressed the final key. The alarm screamed, the reactor core beginning its countdown. As the seconds ticked away, Elena turned to face the observation deck, her gaze fixed on her crew. I'm sorry, she whispered. The reactor's hum rose to a deafening crescendo, and the station was consumed in blinding light. Blinding light engulfed everything, an all-consuming brilliance that erased the station, the anomaly, and even the concept of time itself. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, just a vast, empty silence. Then Elena gasped, her lungs filling with air as if she'd been drowning. Her eyes fluttered open to see a sky full of stars, clear and unbroken. She was lying on something cold and solid, but it wasn't the shattered remains of her station. It was Earth, or something like it. The ground beneath her shimmered with an otherworldly sheen, a blend of glass and metal that reflected the stars above. The horizon stretched endlessly, a surreal expanse of nothingness that felt both infinite and suffocating. She pushed herself upright, her head spinning, her body aching with exhaustion. Elena Marquez. The voice made her freeze. It was deep, resonant, and layered, as if spoken by countless voices in unison. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. Before her stood a figure cloaked in shifting light, its form indistinct and ever-changing. Its face, if it could be called that, was a swirling void of stars, its edges rippling like waves on a still pond. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. It felt like time itself. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are the custodians," the figure said, its voice reverberating through her mind. "Guardians of the timeline, overseers of the threads that bind existence." Elena staggered to her feet, staring at the being with a mix of awe and fear. "Why am I here? Did I succeed?" "You acted to preserve the balance," the custodian said, "but the timeline remains fragile. Your actions have sealed the anomaly, but its echoes will persist." She swallowed hard, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. "What happens now? My station, my crew, are they?" "They are beyond your reach," the custodian said. "Their fates are entwined with the threads you unraveled. Some will endure, others will not." Elena's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, her hands trembling. The faces of her crew flashed in her mind, people who had trusted her, who had believed in her. She had failed them, even in saving the timeline. "But you," the custodian continued, stepping closer, "are not lost." Her head snapped up. "What do you mean?" The custodian extended a hand, or what passed for one, a swirling mass of light and energy. "Your actions have set you apart. You exist now outside the boundaries of time, a fragment of the anomaly's final breath. You are no longer bound by the limitations of your kind." Elena stared at the being, her heart racing. "You're saying I'm untethered? Like you?" "In a manner of speaking," it said. "You have a choice. Remain here, in this liminal space, as a witness to the flow of time, or return to the threads of existence, where your presence may yet influence the future." She frowned, her mind racing. "Return? To what? To when?" The custodian's form shifted, its light dimming slightly. "The choice is yours. To act again, knowing the burden of your decisions, or to rest, free of time's weight." Elena closed her eyes, the enormity of the choice overwhelming her. If she returned, she might face endless questions, mistrust, or even blame. And yet, the thought of doing nothing, of standing by while time marched forward without her, felt like a betrayal to those she had lost. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "If I go back, will I remember all of this?" "Yes," the custodian said, "but memory is both gift and burden." She opened her eyes, her resolve hardening. "Then send me back. Someone has to make sure this doesn't happen again." The custodian's light flared, engulfing her in warmth. "Very well, Elena Marquez. The threads of time will know your name." The stars above began to spin, faster and faster, until they became a vortex of light. Elena felt herself pulled into it, her body weightless, her mind filled with the hum of the timeline's infinite possibilities. When she opened her eyes again, she was back in the station, or rather, what appeared to be the station, pristine, undamaged, and alive with the hum of systems she thought destroyed. Around her, crew members bustled about, their movements fluid and unaware of the chaos that had once consumed them. "Elena," a familiar voice called out. She turned to see Lucas, alive and well, striding toward her with a datapad in hand. "We're ready to begin the experiment. Are you coming?" Her breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't move. This wasn't just a return. It was a reset, a chance to start over. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady. "But first, we're making some changes." Lucas frowned. "Changes? What kind?" Elena smiled faintly, her gaze shifting to the distant stars. "The kind that save us all." As the station moved into position and the experiment began anew, Elena stood ready, not as the scientist she had been, but as the guardian she had become.